We're cruising on to number 8, Little Malawi. Looks like a cute cartoon snake. Why is largely because of the East African Rift. This great series of valleys dominates the geography of East Africa. It's the result of epic geologic forces, literally splitting the continent in two. We'll get more into it further north, but in Malawi, it's created two parallel series of ridges and mountains that flank a very deep valley. This valley has since filled with water and become one of Africa's Great Lakes, Malawi, which is actually named after the country, not the other way around. The lake's deepest point is over 2,300 feet, 700 meters, and has a staggering diversity of fish species, perhaps over 1,000. Malawi lives and dies by this lake, and its outflow, the Shire River. These rich bounties make Malawi one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. Just like in Zimbabwe and Zambia, Malawi is dominated by savannas, Mopane in the lowlands and Miombo in the high. Malawi's mountains and SHEE-ray highlands are covered with a mosaic of forest and grassland. In the southeast are the Lake Chilwa wetlands. The lowlands in the valley are tropical, warm to hot year-round. The highlands subtropical, and winters can be a little chilly. There is the wet season, November to April, the dry, May to October. Like Zambia, Malawi's first inhabitants were a mixed Central and Southern African race, the Batwa, but it was also a nexus for a third group. I call these East African Bushmen, again to be saved for a later episode. They were a cline of peoples, stretching probably from the Zambezi to the bushlands of modern Kenya. A cline is a genetic gradient, where population clusters at either end are genetically distinct, but along the axis the populations anamorph from one to the other. The other end of this cline are ancient East African hunter-gatherers, an Ethiopic race, quite distinct from most modern Ethiopians. And on cue, the Bantu invade, either across the Rift Valley or down the east coast, or possibly both. We've met both groups in Malawi before. The lower Zambezians emerge along the lower shores of the lake to the sea, while north of the Nyika Plateau, the southern lacustrine Bantu arise. The lower Zambezians diverge into Tumbuka in the south Rukuru Valley and Chewa in the rest of Zambezia, with the exception of the Tonga along the Luweya River. The Malawi Tonga are unrelated to the Zambia Tonga, by the way. A fourth group of lower Zambezians break off in the highlands and coast between the Zambezi and Ruvuma rivers. These are the Makua. The southern lacustrines become Rukwa Bantu in Malawi, eventually divided into west, central, and east, and Shona mingle with Chewa in the Zambezi lowlands and become Sena. 1480, and a powerful Chewa chieftain subdues his neighbors and becomes the Koronga, the king of Malawi. The Chewa were ironworkers, and Malawi, or Malawi, means flames, perhaps after the glowing forges that fueled the king's war machine. Soon, Malawi conquered the Tumbuka and Tonga, and expanded west to the Luangwa River and south to the Zambezi. It's unclear if Arabs significantly traded with Malawi before the Portuguese arrive, but afterwards the kingdom becomes part of the Copper Road and Indian Ocean trade. As befitting a Southeast African power, Malawi's contributions were slaves and ivory, while Portuguese also introduced American maize, becoming a staple of the region. Oh, also, so they don't feel left out, our Rukwa friends become more distinct, the central Lambia and the eastern Nyakusa. Moravian power grew, and by the mid-17th century they conquered the Makua and challenged the Portuguese in their nascent colony of Mozambique. This dominance was short-lived, however. Civil war in the 18th century caused the kingdom to contract. A 1-2 punch hit Malawi in the 1830s. The Yao people, associates of Swahili and Arab traders in Zanzibar, pushed towards the southern shore of Lake Malawi. Wealthy and fierce from their dealings with the Muslims, they set up shop here to capture and trade people for the slave trade. 1835, the Nguni chieftain Zwangendaba, having fled from the depredations of Mfikane in Zululand, settles along the western shore of the lake. The weak and fractured Malawi kingdom can't put up much of a fight, and Zwangendaba reduces the Chewa to the Shire River, establishing his own Ngoni kingdom. He, or lesser chieftains, even crossed the lake to the upper Rovuma River. But in 1848, when Zwangendaba dies, his realm splits. The Maseko clan claims the largest portion in the south, while the king's own Jele heirs claim the Tumbuka and Tonga lands in the north. Across the lake, the Gwangara clan breaks off. The Yao and Ngoni terrorize the natives of the region, for plunder, for fun, but mainly for slaves. Soon, Arabs from Zanzibar join in, setting up trade posts throughout the lakelands. The Arabs even managed to convert the Yao to Islam. 1869, and Portugal finally outlaws slavery in its colonies. Originally, these slaves were bound for Portuguese plantations in Brazil. Now, the trade has shifted to the Middle East and beyond, even to India and China. Slaving was good business, but around this time, explorers from Europe were trekking and charting the interior of Africa. Many, like Dr. David Livingstone, were missionaries, eager to spread the word of God to the Africans, and they found themselves a moral mission to fight the slave trade. Many of these missionaries were Scottish Presbyterians, and in 1876, Blantyre was founded as a base. The next year, the Livingstonia Central Africa Trading Company was formed to raise money for their mission work. It was soon renamed to the African Lakes Corporation. Portugal, having been in Mozambique for so long, was getting antsy that other Europeans were moving in on their turf. In 1879, they pushed their claims to the Roe River. 1882, they expanded to the lower Shire. 1883, and the African Lakes Corporation founds another post at Karonga among the Nyakusa, but the British government would not grant them a charter like the later British South Africa Company would get. The Berlin Conference lit a fire under the Portuguese, and they moved to secure the coveted corridor between Angola and Mozambique through Zambezia. They rushed to secure treaties with the local chiefs, but didn't have much luck. Turns out, while the British government didn't really want to take over the area, they didn't want the Portuguese to either, and had their agent Henry Hamilton Johnston sabotage them. His, and men like Cecil Rhodes' agitation ensured the matter remained open. Lord Salisbury's government wasn't keen on expending British money on securing some random backwater in the heart of Africa, preferring to let the BSAC do that. In 1889, Johnston declared two protectorates, one in the Shire Highlands, the other west as Nyasaland. The British Foreign Office ignored them. But that same year, the British discovered the Zambezi could be navigated by ocean-going ships. This changed things. This meant the Zambezi became international waters, and any expansion in the interior might actually be worth it. Finally, the British decided Zambezia should be theirs, and they issued an ultimatum to Portugal in 1890 to abandon all its claims west of the Roe River. The Portuguese caved and withdrew. The same year, Britain and Germany decided on their spheres of influence. In Malawi, it was the Songwe River. 1891, Britain and Portugal agreed to their border. Because Portuguese presence in Sumbo was established, Mozambique was granted its little thumb. So from the Luangwa River along that line, the boundary was drawn south along the watershed between the Shire River and the rest of the Zambezi, to about the 17th south latitude, east to the Shire River itself, up to the Roe River, and then along the river to a series of lines east of Lake Chilwa, and thence northwest to the shore of Lake Malawi. With the Portuguese dealt with, the British split off a territory from the claims of the BSAC at the Luangwa Malawi watershed. This eastern territory was declared the Nyasa Land District's Protectorate, Nyasa being the Makua word for lake. Johnston, Rhodes, and the Scottish missionaries got what they wanted, a formal British protectorate along the lake, its capital at Zomba. The missionaries' work was so thorough, in fact, that today the majority religion of all the countries we've covered in southern Africa so far is Christianity, of various denominations. But the BSAC bought out the African Lakes Corporation by 1891, taking over administration, meaning the missionaries were no longer in charge. However, the matter of control remained. The Marawi Rump chieftains and the Rukwa in the north agreed to British protection, but the Yao, Ngoni, and Arabs remained tougher nuts to crack. In 1893, the protectorate was renamed to Central Africa, and its new Commissioner Johnston recruited Indian and African mercenaries to secure control. By 1895, the Yao and Arabs had been defeated, and a mortal blow struck to the Nyasaland slave trade. 1896, the Maseko Ngoni are shattered, their kingdom divided between Portugal and Britain. Only in 1904 did the northern Jele Ngoni accept British rule, but finally the protectorate was completely assembled. The BSAC tried to claim it as their property, like the Rhodesias, but Johnston and his successor didn't want to play ball. In 1907, it was renamed Nyasaland, probably because Central Africa was too much for a protectorate that comprised little beyond the shores of the lake. Nyasaland was effectively annexed by the British government, its commissioner promoted to governor, removing it from the control of the BSAC. However, the company did maintain ownership of a large portion of land. And speaking of land, Johnston hoped to turn the protectorate into a settler colony like southern Rhodesia. Large portions of land were appropriated by the government for white settlement, and settle whites did, collecting labor taxes from the natives. Nyasaland became an exporter of tobacco, cotton, and tea, but the soil was poorly suited to the kind of agricultural techniques familiar to Europeans, and as land became exhausted, more land was appropriated. This sparked a rebellion in 1915, led by a native Baptist pastor. Though defeated, the rebellion convinced the British to slow down and finally end their acquisition of land from the natives. They were stretched thin in Nyasaland, where whites remained a very tiny minority. As European plantation prioritized cash crops, that left the production of food to the natives. It was adequate mostly, but policy favored planters and trade was strictly controlled. Nyasaland remained a quiet farming colony even after World War II, but in 1949, a severe drought and poor policy led to a famine. It wasn't a huge famine, as world famines go. Less than 1,000 people died of starvation. But it did cause the government to reevaluate its priorities. Native land was enlarged, and policy relaxed to make native farms more competitive, and natives were allowed seats on the Legislative Council. There wasn't much else going on in Nyasaland besides agriculture, and a post-war Britain tried to soften its financial burden and maybe stimulate economic growth by merging Nyasaland and the Rhodesias into a federation. Nobody was happy with it, really. Whites didn't like their already precarious rule disrupted by more African natives, and African natives felt it was disrupting their political ambitions. Riots occurred in Nyasaland, and the Nyasaland African Congress agitated for an end to this farce. The situation in Nyasaland soon became violent, and finally the British realized they couldn't hold on to power. Nyasaland was given responsible government in 1963, NAC leader Hastings Banda becoming Prime Minister. Later that year, the Federation was formally dissolved. Nyasaland had it, and in 1964 became independent. Prime Minister Banda renamed the country to Malawi, but I have conflicting accounts of why. The cute story is he saw it on a French map referring to a lake somewhere in the East Sahara, but it's probably just named after the Kingdom of Malawi. Either way, Malawi began not as a republic, but as a kingdom. Who was king? I'll tell you. Britain's absolute last effort to save face was to grant independence to its former colonies as commonwealths. Like Canada and Australia, Malawi became a fully sovereign state, but its monarch continued to be the ruler of the United Kingdom, being Elizabeth II. Modern day, this Commonwealth realm persists, though its constituents are fully separate from one another. I could color Malawi the same as Britain, like a personal union, but by this point the British monarch doesn't really govern the realms, so it doesn't really feel right. But Malawi's own color also doesn't convey the unique political situation. Either way, 1966, they did away with the monarchy and became the Republic of Malawi. Banda became president, and what's more, of a one-party state. It became a lifelong calling in 1971, His Excellency, the Life President. Banda ruled like a king, demanding adulation from his people, and enforced strict rules and treating the country as his personal property. Undoubtedly authoritarian, cracking down on challenges to his authority, he doesn't seem to have been terribly vicious or cruel as dictator. He was, though, fiercely anti-communist. He moved the capital to Lilongwe in 1975 and promoted investment in infrastructure and education. He also tried to start some industrialization. Poor country was hit hard by the oil crisis of the late 1970s. With the end of the Cold War, aid from the U.S. slowed down, and soon Banda faced pressure to democratize. A free election was held in 1994, and he fell from power, an old man in his late 90s. Democracy, however, brought sectarian tensions, northern Christians against southern Muslims. This calmed down in the late 2000s, and Malawi has settled into a fairly stable democracy. However, the country remains very poor and agrarian. Malawi has neither the mineral wealth nor the agricultural infrastructure of the former Rhodesias, and the country faces financial obstacles. Though, thanks to Banda, Malawi is one of Africa's most prolific countries when it comes to scientific research, specking in science at the expense of everything else, I guess. Alright, I don't know about you, but I'm ready to take a break from former British colonies, so let's round up southern Africa with Mozambique. See you there.